The moment I stepped into the apartment building lobby, I could feel their eyes on me. Not just watching, judging. Two maintenance men huddled near the elevator, not even trying to hide their smirks as they sized me up. "That's the new tenant. In 4B, one whispered, loud enough for me to hear. "Management's giving it 3 months, tops." The other chuckled. "I give her 6 weeks before she's running back to wherever she came from. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." I kept my head high and pressed the elevator button, pretending not to hear them. But their words burrowed under my skin. Little did they know I wasn't someone who backed down easily. And those whispers about me not lasting long? They lit a fire in me that would end up burning down their entire operation. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags from the beginning. But when you're desperate for housing in a city like Boston, where rent prices soar higher than the skyscrapers, you learn to ignore certain things. After my roommate of 3 years decided to move across the country for a job opportunity, I had exactly 45 days to find a new place to live. The West Ridge apartments seemed perfect on paper. Located in a trendy neighborhood with reasonable rent and utilities included, I practically sprinted to sign the lease before someone else could snatch it up. The leasing agent, Marissa Coleman, had a smile that never quite reached her eyes as she handed me the keys. "Welcome to the West Ridge family," she said mechanically. "We hope you'll be comfortable here." My first night was memorable for all the wrong reasons. The radiator in my bedroom clanged so loudly I thought someone was breaking in. The water from the bathroom tap ran brown for a full minute before clearing. But I told myself these were minor issues that could be fixed. I had signed a 12-month lease after all. This was home now, whether I liked it or not. The next morning, I submitted my first maintenance request through the tenant portal for the radiator and water issues. The confirmation email promised a response within 48 hours. 5 days later, I was still waiting. When I called the management office, the receptionist, Taylor, sounded almost amused by my frustration. "First-time renter?" she asked condescendingly. "No," I replied, my patience wearing thin. "I've been renting for 7 years." "Well, maintenance is backed up. They'll get to it when they get to it. Maybe next week if you're lucky." I told myself to be patient. Every building had its quirks, right? But as days turned into weeks, the problems multiplied. The washing machines in the basement laundry room ate my quarters without running. The security door to the building frequently jammed, leaving tenants locked out until someone inside happened to walk by. And worst of all, the heating system seemed to have exactly 2 settings: Arctic freeze or Sahara desert. Through it all, my maintenance requests piled up, each one ignored or dismissed with vague promises of, "We'll look into it." I started to notice a pattern. Certain tenants seemed to get immediate responses, while others, like me, were perpetually at the bottom of the priority list. One evening in early October, about 6 weeks after moving in, I bumped into my next-door neighbor, Ellie Rodriguez, struggling to carry groceries while balancing her phone between her ear and shoulder. I helped her with the bags and couldn't help overhearing her heated conversation. "This is the 4th time I've called about the mold. In my bathroom," she was saying. "My daughter's asthma is getting worse, and I need someone to address this immediately." After she hung up, looking defeated, I introduced myself properly. Over cups of tea in her apartment, Ellie shared her experiences at West Ridge. "They prey on people who don't have many options," she explained. "Single parents, young professionals just starting out, immigrants, anyone they think won't fight back. They count on us being too busy or too intimidated to challenge them." "But that can't be legal," I protested. Ellie's laugh was hollow. "Legal? Maybe not. But proving it is another story. Management has gotten very good at operating in gray areas." That night, I couldn't sleep. The conversation with Ellie had stirred something in me, a combination of anger and determination that kept my mind racing. I started researching tenant rights in Massachusetts, learning about laws that protected renters from negligent landlords. By morning, I had a plan. First, I documented everything. Every maintenance request, every ignored email, every phone call. I took dated photos of all issues in my apartment. Then I started talking to other tenants. Cautiously at first, just casual conversations in the elevator or laundry room. Having any issues with your apartment? Yeah, me too. Many seemed resigned to the situation, but a few were eager to share their frustrations once they realized they weren't alone. Jason Mitchell from 3A had been waiting 3 months for a leak in his ceiling to be fixed. Maria Thompson in 2C had mold growing behind her refrigerator that management insisted was just condensation. And Robert and Sarah Wilson in 5D had paid for emergency plumbing repairs out of pocket after management failed to respond to a burst pipe. The more stories I collected, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't negligence, it was strategy. Westridge deliberately ignored maintenance issues for certain tenants, hoping they would break their leases out of frustration. Then management could raise the rent for the next tenant. The "won't last" long comment wasn't just an insult, it was their business model. I reached out to the Boston Housing Authority and described the situation. The representative I spoke with, Derek Montgomery, sounded unsurprised. Unfortunately, this is more common than you might think, he explained. But you've done the right thing by documenting everything. Massachusetts has strong tenant protection laws. Derek advised me to formally request repairs in writing, citing the specific housing code violations. Send it certified mail, he suggested. That creates a paper trail they can't ignore. If they don't respond within a reasonable time frame, you have options. Armed with this information, I drafted letters for myself and the other affected tenants. We each sent formal requests for repairs, detailing the issues and the relevant housing codes they violated. The letters concluded with a clear deadline: 14 days to address the problems or we would pursue further action. The response was immediate and hostile. The day after the letters were delivered, I received a call from Victor Chambers, the property manager. His voice dripped with barely contained anger. "Ms. Parker," he began, "I understand you've been stirring up trouble among the tenants." "I wouldn't call it trouble," I replied calmly. "We're simply requesting the repairs we're entitled to under our leases and state law." "Listen carefully," Victor's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "People like you come and go. Westridge has been here for 20 years, and will be here long after you've moved on. If you know what's good for you, you'll drop this little crusade." The threat was clear, but instead of intimidating me, it only strengthened my resolve. "I've documented that threat, Mr. Chambers," I informed him. "Now, will you be addressing the repairs within the time frame specified, or should we proceed to the next step?" He hung up without answering. The next day, I found an eviction notice taped to my door claiming I had violated my lease by creating disturbances and interfering with management operations. Similar notices appeared on the doors of the other tenants who had sent letters. Ellie called me in tears, terrified of losing her home. "This is exactly what they want," I told her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "They're trying to scare us into backing down. But this retaliatory eviction is illegal, and they know it." I contacted Derek at the Housing Authority again and explained the situation. He connected me with Angela Harper, a lawyer who specialized in tenant rights cases and often worked pro bono for housing justice issues. Angela reviewed our documentation during our first meeting and smiled. "They've made this almost too easy," she said. "Retaliatory eviction following formal repair requests? That's textbook illegal, but we need to move quickly." With Angela's guidance, we filed for an emergency injunction to stop the evictions and submitted a formal complaint to the state's Attorney General's office, alleging systematic housing code violations and discriminatory practices. Angela also helped us organize a tenant association, giving us a unified voice and legal standing as a group. Word spread quickly throughout the building. More tenants came forward with their stories, eager to join our cause. We held meetings in the community room, the one amenity management couldn't easily take away since it was advertised in our leases. What had started as a simple quest to get my radiator fixed had evolved into a full-blown tenant rebellion. Management's next move was to send in maintenance crews who performed hasty, inadequate repairs and then claimed the issues were resolved. They replaced Ellie's moldy bathroom tiles but didn't address the moisture problem causing the mold. They silenced my radiator by simply turning off the heat to my unit entirely. It was all superficial, designed to create the appearance of compliance, without actually fixing anything. But we were documenting everything, building our case day by day. Angela advised us to continue paying rent, to place it in an escrow account she established, ensuring we were fulfilling our obligations while protecting ourselves legally. The weeks that followed were tense. Small acts of intimidation became routine. Security cameras suddenly appeared in hallways, pointed directly at the apartments of tenant association members. Maintenance requests from association members were marked as completed in the system without anyone ever showing up. Mail occasionally went missing, but with each incident, our case grew stronger. 2 months after that first hostile phone call from Victor, I received another call, this time from an unknown number. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Thomas Wilson, legal counsel, for Westview Properties, the parent company that owned Westridge Apartments. "Ms. Parker," he began smoothly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding between you and the local management team. Westview Properties prides itself on providing quality housing, and the issues you've raised are concerning to us. We'd like to offer you a solution." The solution was a bribe, thinly disguised as a settlement, immediate release from my lease with a full security deposit refund, 3 months' rent as compensation, and a non-disclosure agreement preventing me from discussing Westridge's practices with anyone, including other tenants or government agencies. "This offer extends only to you," Thomas emphasized. "We feel you've been particularly inconvenienced." They were trying to cut out the leader, hoping the movement would fall apart without me. It was clever, I had to admit. 3 months ago, before I knew my neighbors, before I understood my rights, I might have taken the deal. But now, I appreciate the offer, Mr. Wilson, I said, choosing my words carefully. But I'm not interested in individual solutions to a collective problem. The tenant association will continue pursuing this matter until all repairs are properly addressed and the illegal eviction notices are withdrawn. There was a long pause before Thomas spoke again, his polished veneer cracking slightly. "That's unfortunate. I should warn you that housing litigation can be extremely lengthy and costly. Westview has significant resources at its disposal." "So do we," I replied, thinking of the growing file of evidence, the support from the housing authority, and Angela's determination. And more importantly, we have the law on our side. After hanging up, I immediately called Angela to report the conversation. She was delighted. "Attempted bribery and intimidation," she noted. "Add it to the file. They're getting desperate, which means we're winning." The next day, I made one more phone call, the one that would change everything. With Angela conferenced, I contacted the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division and formally requested an investigation into Westview Properties practices, not just at Westridge, but at all their properties throughout Massachusetts. "We have reason to believe this is a systemic issue affecting hundreds, possibly thousands of tenants," I explained, sharing our documentation and the testimonies we'd collected. 3 days later, investigators from the Attorney General's office arrived at Westridge, accompanied by housing inspectors and officials from the Boston Housing Authority. They spent an entire day examining the building, interviewing tenants, and reviewing maintenance records. The following week, Victor Chambers was placed on administrative leave. Marissa Coleman, the leasing agent, resigned abruptly, and the maintenance men who had whispered that I wouldn't last long were nowhere to be seen. In their place came a team of contractors working diligently to address the backlog of repairs. Ellie's mold problem was properly remediated. Jason's ceiling was fixed. The building's heating system was overhauled. Even the security door and washing machines were repaired. A representative from Westview Properties' corporate office arrived to personally apologize to the tenant association and announce new management would be taking over. The eviction notices were withdrawn, and tenants who had paid for their own repairs were reimbursed. As I watched the flurry of activity from my now properly heated apartment, I thought about those whispers in the lobby on my first day. They had been right about one thing. I hadn't lasted long, at least not as the kind of tenant they expected me to be. Instead, I had become something they never anticipated, a catalyst for change. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their prediction that I wouldn't last long had been meant as an insult, a dismissal of my resilience. But in the end, it was their corrupt system that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Their occupancy as negligent managers had indeed been made shorter, with just one phone call. The victory at Westridge Apartments felt like the end of a long battle, but it was only the beginning. 3 weeks after the Attorney General's investigation began, I received an unexpected email from someone named Zoe Harrison. The subject line read, "What you did at Westridge. Can you help us too?" Zoe lived in Parkview Heights, another property owned by Westview in a neighboring district. The conditions there were even worse than what we'd experienced at Westridge. Tenants were dealing with electrical outages, sewage backups, and security issues that management refused to address. Their situation sounded eerily familiar. I heard, "What you accomplished," Zoe wrote. "Some of us are ready to fight back, but we don't know where to start." I forwarded the email to Angela, our lawyer, who responded within minutes. "This is bigger than we thought," she wrote. "If you're up for it, I think we have an opportunity to create real, lasting change." The next evening, Angela and I met with Zoe and 5 other Parkview residents at a coffee shop midway between our buildings. They brought photos, maintenance requests, and email exchanges that mirrored our experiences at Westridge. The same patterns, the same dismissive responses, even some of the same management personnel. Marcus Thompson, an elderly veteran who had lived at Parkview for over a decade, pushed a folder across the table. "Last winter, we had no heat for 2 weeks. My neighbor, Mrs. Collins, ended up in the hospital with pneumonia. When I complained, they said we should use space heaters or move somewhere else." Diana Lewis, a single mother of 2, showed us photos of black mold creeping across her bathroom ceiling. "My son's asthma has gotten so bad he can't play sports anymore. Management told me to use bleach and stop taking showers that are too hot." Looking at their evidence, a realization dawned on me. This wasn't just negligence or poor management. It was a calculated business strategy. Westview Properties was deliberately neglecting buildings in neighborhoods where property values were rising, making conditions so unbearable that long-term tenants would leave. Then they could renovate superficially and double the rent for new tenants. "This is tenant harassment as corporate policy," Angela said, organizing the documents methodically. "And it's not just happening at these 2 properties. Over the next few weeks, our small group expanded as we connected with tenants from 7 different Westview properties across the city. We created a secure online forum where people could share their experiences and documentation safely. The stories poured in, hundreds of them, each more infuriating than the last. At Riverdale Commons, maintenance staff had removed the lobby furniture to discourage teens from loitering and building community. At Willowbrook Gardens, management had eliminated overnight security despite a series of break-ins. At the Madison, they'd shut down the elevator for repairs that never seemed to progress, effectively trapping elderly and disabled residents in their units. Throughout it all, Westview employed the same tactics: ignore maintenance requests, blame tenants for problems, threaten eviction when complaints persisted, and offer secret settlements to vocal organizers. It was systematic, deliberate, and, as Angela repeatedly emphasized, illegal. What we're seeing is a violation of the implied warranty of habitability, she explained during one of our group meetings. Every residential lease comes with this warranty, whether it's written down or not. Landlords are legally required to maintain properties in a condition that's safe and suitable for living. With Angela's guidance, we formed a citywide Westview Tenants Union. Our first official act was to draft a comprehensive list of demands: immediate repairs of all outstanding maintenance issues, fair treatment for all tenants, regardless of income or background, transparent communication about building management, and compensation for those who had suffered health issues or property damage due to negligence. When we presented these demands to Westview's corporate office, their response was swift and predictable. A cease and desist letter claiming we were engaging in defamatory activities and interfering with business operations. It was accompanied by a thinly veiled threat of legal action against the ringleaders of our organization. "They're scared," Angela said when I showed her the letter. "This is exactly how corporate landlords react when tenants organize effectively. They're used to dealing with individuals they can intimidate or buy off. They don't know how to handle collective action." Our next step was publicity. We contacted local news outlets, sharing our documentation and personal stories. The response exceeded our expectations. Channel 7's investigative team ran a 3-part series on housing conditions in Westview properties. The Boston Globe published a front-page article featuring interviews with dozens of affected tenants. Community radio stations invited union members to share their experiences on air. Public outrage grew with each new revelation. City council members began asking questions. The mayor's office issued a statement promising to look into these serious allegations. Even state legislators took notice, with one representative announcing plans to introduce a bill strengthening tenant protections. Westview's initial response was to hire a crisis management firm. Suddenly, professionally designed flyers appeared in all their buildings, touting a new commitment to tenant satisfaction and announcing a rapid response maintenance program. They launched a glossy website showcasing testimonials from supposedly satisfied residents, though tenants quickly noted that none of the people pictured actually lived in their buildings. "Classic corporate playbook," Angela observed. "When caught doing wrong, don't actually change. Just rebrand the wrongdoing." But the pressure continued to mount. The Attorney General's investigation expanded to include all 37 Westview properties in the state. Housing inspectors descended on buildings, documenting thousands of code violations. The city suspended Westview's rental licenses for 3 properties, preventing them from signing new leases until repairs were completed. Throughout it all, our union continued to grow. We held weekly meetings, rotating between different properties to make attendance easier. We established a mutual aid fund to help tenants with emergency repairs, legal fees, or temporary relocation if needed. We created committees focused on different aspects of our fight: legal documentation, media relations, new member outreach, and direct action planning. The solidarity we built went beyond housing issues. When Diana's son had an asthma attack and needed expensive medication not covered by insurance, union members pooled resources to help. When Marcus needed transportation to VA appointments, a ride-sharing system emerged. When a fire damaged several units at Riverdale, tenants from other buildings offered spare rooms and supplies. "This is what they're really afraid of," Ellie told me one evening as we watched children from different buildings playing together at a union family picnic. "Not just that, we'll force them to fix the heat or stop the illegal evictions. They're afraid we'll realize we're stronger together than alone." 4 months into our campaign, we received word that Westview's board of directors had called an emergency meeting. 3 days later, the news broke. CEO Bradford Williams had stepped down to pursue other opportunities. In his place, the board appointed Patricia Goodman, an experienced property manager known for her work with affordable housing nonprofits. The following week, Patricia requested a meeting with representatives from our union. In a conference room at the public library, she faced 5 of us across the table. Myself, Zoe from Parkview, Marcus from Willowbrook, Diana from Riverdale, and Angela representing our legal interests. "I've reviewed the documentation you've provided," Patricia began, her tone professional but not hostile. "And I've personally toured 12 of our properties in the past week. What I've seen is troubling, to say the least." She placed a thick binder on the table. "This is our immediate action plan. It includes a complete overhaul of maintenance protocols, termination of managers who engaged in discriminatory practices, and a tenant satisfaction guarantee with concrete benchmarks." We listened skeptically as she outlined their plans. Repairs would begin immediately, prioritized by severity rather than tenant status. Management staff would undergo fair housing training. A tenant liaison position would be created at each property. "This all sounds promising," Angela said when Patricia finished. "But these tenants have heard promises before. What assurances? Can you provide that these changes will actually happen?" Patricia nodded, acknowledging the concern. "That's why I'd like to propose something unprecedented. We want to establish a joint oversight committee, half Westview representatives, half tenant union representatives, with real authority to monitor progress, approve budgets for repairs, and address ongoing concerns." The proposal was unexpected. We asked for time to discuss it privately and with the wider union membership. "She seems sincere," Zoe said once Patricia left the room. "Maybe," Marcus replied, still skeptical. "But corporations don't change their nature overnight." "It's not about trust," Angela reminded us. "It's about verifiable actions and enforceable agreements. What she's proposing would give you unprecedented influence over how these properties are managed." After extensive discussions with our members, we presented a counter-proposal. We would participate in the oversight committee, but we also wanted a legally binding agreement covering all the repairs, policy changes, and compensation for affected tenants. Additionally, we asked for a commitment to maintain affordable rents and cease any attempt to push out long-term residents. Negotiations stretched over several weeks, but eventually, we reached an agreement. Westview would invest $15 million in immediate repairs across all properties. Management staff at every building would be evaluated, with tenant input considered in retention decisions. A rent stabilization plan would be implemented, limiting increases for existing tenants. And the Joint Oversight Committee would have real power, including the ability to review budgets and approve major policy changes. The signing ceremony was held in the community room at Westridge, the same room where our organizing had begun. As Patricia and I signed the final agreement, surrounded by union members and media cameras, I thought about how far we had come from those dismissive whispers on my first day. The changes didn't happen overnight. Some repairs took months to complete. Properly. Not every manager embraced the new approach. There were setbacks and disagreements, but slowly, unmistakably, conditions improved. Maintenance requests received prompt responses. Security issues were addressed. Common areas were renovated and actually maintained. More importantly, the balance of power had shifted. Tenants no longer felt helpless against a faceless corporation. They had a voice, representation, and recourse when problems arose. The Oversight Committee met monthly, reviewing progress reports and addressing new concerns before they could become crises. 6 months after our agreement, I received another unexpected email, this time from a tenant group in Chicago facing similar issues with a different corporate landlord. "We heard about what you accomplished in Boston," they wrote. "Can you share your strategies?" Soon, requests were coming in from cities across the country: Philadelphia, Atlanta, Seattle, Denver. Angela and I began putting together resources, organizing, guides, legal templates, sample media outreach plans. We created webinars explaining the documentation process and coalition building strategies. The model we had developed was spreading, adapting to local conditions but maintaining the core principle: tenant power through collective action. 1 year to the day after those maintenance men had whispered that I wouldn't last long, I stood in the newly renovated lobby of Westridge, looking at the building directory. Next to the management office listing was a new addition: Tenant Liaison Office, open Monday, Friday, 9 a.m., 5 p.m. Ellie joined me, her daughter dancing around us excitedly. "Remember when we were afraid to even talk about our problems?" she asked. Now look at us. Us had grown far beyond what I could have imagined. What started as a desperate attempt to get my radiator fixed had evolved into a movement affecting thousands of renters. The Westview Tenants Union had become a model for housing advocacy, and I had found purpose in helping other tenant groups organize effectively. As I headed toward my apartment, where the heat now worked properly, the water ran clear, and management actually responded to concerns, I passed the maintenance office. Through the open door, I spotted a framed document on the wall: the tenant rights charter that had been part of our agreement, prominently displayed for all to see. One of the new maintenance technicians, hired after our agreement was implemented, nodded respectfully as I passed. "Afternoon, Ms. Parker. Everything working okay in your unit?" "Yes," I replied with a smile. "Everything's working exactly as it should." Later that evening, as I helped Diana prepare for an upcoming oversight committee meeting, she asked me a question I'd heard many times before. "What made you decide to stand up to them when everyone else was just putting up with it? Weren't you scared of retaliation?" The answer had evolved over time, becoming clearer with each telling. "Of course I was scared," I admitted. "But something about those whispers on my first day, that prediction that I wouldn't last long, wasn't just an insult. It was a revelation about how the system worked. They needed us to feel powerless, isolated, and temporary. They counted on our silence and our surrender." I showed her the agenda for our upcoming committee meeting, where we would be reviewing progress on the accessibility upgrades for the building. The moment we stopped being afraid and started working together, their power began to crumble. They were right that I wouldn't last long as the kind of tenant they wanted, someone who would suffer in silence or simply leave. Instead, I became the kind of tenant they never expected, one who knew her rights, built community, and refused to be intimidated. What began with a dismissive whisper had culminated in a roar of collective action. The maintenance men who predicted my short tenure were long gone, but the changes we'd fought for would benefit tenants for years to come. In trying to shorten my stay, they had inadvertently shortened their own occupancy and transformed the housing landscape in the process. As our movement continued to grow beyond Boston, connecting with tenant organizations nationwide, I often thought about that crucial phone call to the Attorney General's office. It had been a turning point, certainly, but the real power hadn't come from any single action or individual. It had come from transforming isolation into solidarity, resignation into resistance. They had whispered I wouldn't last long, never imagining that their words would spark a revolution that would outlast them all. 3 years after our initial victory at Westridge Apartments, I found myself standing before a packed auditorium at the National Housing Rights Conference in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of tenant organizers, housing advocates, and policy experts had gathered to discuss the growing nationwide movement for affordable, dignified housing. The most powerful tool in a tenant's arsenal isn't a lawsuit or a media campaign, though those are certainly important, I explained to the attentive crowd. It's the realization that you're not alone. The isolation that landlords rely on to maintain their power crumbles the moment tenants begin talking to each other. As I shared our story, from those dismissive whispers in the lobby to the formation of the Westview Tenants Union to the nationwide network we had since developed, I could see recognition in the eyes of people who had lived through similar struggles. The tactics varied from city to city, company to company, but the underlying dynamics remained consistent. Corporate landlords maximizing profit at the expense of habitability, counting on tenant vulnerability and isolation to escape accountability after CAR. My keynote address, a line of people waited to speak with me. Among them was Congresswoman Vanessa Mitchell, who had recently introduced the Tenant Protection Act in the House of Representatives. "Your organizing model directly influenced several provisions in the bill," she told me excitedly, "especially the sections on tenant oversight committees and protection against retaliatory evictions. We've incorporated case studies from Boston, Chicago, and Portland to demonstrate why these protections are necessary." The conference marked a milestone in our journey from local crisis to national movement. What had begun as a desperate effort to get basic repairs done had evolved into a systematic approach to housing justice that was being replicated, adapted, and expanded across the country. But while I was proud of how far we'd come, I remained acutely aware of how much work lay ahead. Corporate ownership of residential housing had reached unprecedented levels, with private equity firms and real estate investment trusts acquiring buildings at a staggering pace. Many of these new owners had little interest in the day-to-day realities of property management. They viewed apartment buildings simply as assets on a balance sheet, tenants as revenue streams rather than people. During a panel discussion on the final day of the conference, I met Darius Jackson, a housing attorney from Atlanta who specialized in cases involving private equity landlords. "The landscape is changing faster than our legal frameworks can adapt," he warned a group of us during a breakout session. 10 years ago, you could identify who owned your building. Now, ownership is deliberately obscured through layers of LLCs and holding companies. Tenants don't even know who to hold accountable." His words resonated with me. Despite our successes with Westview, we had been fortunate in some ways. Our opponent was identifiable, with a corporate headquarters and public-facing brand to protect. Many tenants now faced faceless investment entities that operated from offshore tax havens and seemed impervious to public pressure or legal challenges. As the conference concluded, I exchanged contact information with organizers from 16 different cities, each grappling with variations of the same problem. We pledged to stay connected, share resources, and coordinate our efforts across state lines. The fight was evolving, and so were we. Upon returning to Boston, I discovered that our local landscape had changed significantly during my absence. Westview Properties had been acquired by Horizon Capital Partners, a private equity firm with a portfolio spanning 27 states. The oversight committee we had fought so hard to establish was being quietly undermined, with corporate representatives frequently missing meetings or sending unprepared substitutes without decision-making. "Authority. They're waiting us out," Marcus observed during an emergency union meeting. Now in his late 70s but still sharp as ever, he had become something of an elder statesman in our movement. "They think if they drag their feet long enough, we'll lose interest or move away. Or they're deliberately creating conditions for a legal argument that the agreement isn't working," Angela added. She had expanded her practice to include 5 attorneys focused exclusively on tenant rights cases. They could claim the committee structure is ineffective and petition to dissolve it. The acquisition posed new challenges, but it also created an opportunity. If Horizon owned properties in multiple states, we could potentially connect with tenant groups across their entire portfolio. What had worked against Westview locally might work against Horizon nationally. I reached out to my new contacts from the conference, asking if any of them had Horizon properties in their cities. Within days, responses flooded in from Chicago, Miami, Seattle, Denver, and Austin. Each city had its own stories of declining conditions, ignored maintenance, and aggressive rent increases following Horizon's acquisitions. They purchased the entire Lakeview Heights complex last year, wrote Cameron Reynolds from Chicago. Since then, they've eliminated on-site management, installed surveillance cameras everywhere, and raised rents by 22% on average. When tenants complain, they're offered buyouts to leave. From Seattle, Lisa Nakamura reported similar tactics. They've introduced something called amenity fees on top of rent, charging separately for access to the fitness center, package room, and even the laundry area, all of which used to be included. It's a backdoor way of raising rents beyond what leases allow. Working with Angela and her team, we began mapping Horizon's holdings and practices across the country. Patterns emerged quickly. They targeted buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods, implemented cosmetic upgrades to common areas while neglecting structural repairs, and aggressively pushed out long-term tenants to bring in higher-paying newcomers. Most troublingly, they seemed to have studied the Westview case and developed countermeasures to prevent similar organizing. Buildings were divided into separate LLC entities, making it harder to prove common ownership. On-site staff were replaced with rotating management companies. Lease agreements were revised to include anti-organizing clauses that prohibited tenant meetings in common areas or distribution of unauthorized communications to other residents. They've learned from our victory, I told the union leadership team. Now we need to learn from their response and adapt our strategy. Over the next 6 months, we built what we called the Horizon Tenant Network, a coalition of tenant organizations in every city where Horizon owned property. We established secure communication channels, shared documentation tactics, and developed coordinated action plans. While Horizon had tried to divide us by property, city, and state, we were creating connections that transcended those artificial boundaries. Our first coordinated action took place simultaneously across 11 cities. On the same day, tenant representatives delivered identical letters to property management offices, outlining shared concerns and demanding a meeting with Horizon's executive leadership. The letters were also sent to local media outlets, housing authorities, and elected officials. Horizon's initial response was to ignore us, but that approach became untenable as local news coverage mounted. When the governor of Massachusetts mentioned the concerning reports about Horizon's management practices during a press conference, the company finally issued a statement acknowledging the complaints and promising to review tenant concerns thoroughly. 2 weeks later, we received communication from Horizon's newly appointed Director of Resident Relations, Allison Cooper, requesting a meeting with representatives from our network. We agreed, but insisted the meeting be held in a neutral location and include tenant representatives from at least 5 different cities. The meeting took place at a hotel conference room in Chicago. 6 of us represented the tenant network, facing Allison and 3 Horizon executives across a long table. From the outset, it was clear they had expected to placate us with vague assurances and minor concessions. We value resident satisfaction and are committed to addressing your concerns, Allison began, her corporate smile never wavering. We've prepared a comprehensive response to the issues raised in your letters. What followed was a PowerPoint presentation highlighting Horizon's investment in communities and plans for enhancing resident experience. The substance, however, was thin. Promises to review maintenance procedures, consider rent increase caps, and evaluate the need for on-site management at larger properties. When she finished, the room fell silent. Then Gabriela Suarez, representing Miami tenants, spoke up. Ms. Cooper, with all due respect, this presentation doesn't address our actual demands. We're not asking for reviews or evaluations. We're asking for specific, measurable commitments to maintain habitable conditions and fair treatment, Philip. Morris, Horizon's chief operating officer, leaned forward. The reality is that housing is a business. We have obligations to our investors that limit our flexibility on certain issues, particularly rental rates. And we have rights as tenants that limit your flexibility on habitability, discrimination, and retaliation, I countered. Rights that exist regardless of your business model. The meeting grew tense as we pressed for concrete commitments rather than corporate platitudes. Finally, Ryan Thompson, Horizon's legal counsel, cut in. Look, We agreed to this meeting as a courtesy, but Horizon isn't Westview. The agreement you forced on them nearly bankrupted the company. That's why they were vulnerable to acquisition. We have no intention of repeating their mistakes. His candor was refreshing, if alarming. At least we knew where we stood. Then we have no intention of repeating our mistakes either, I replied. Last time we spent months trying to resolve issues, through traditional channels before going public. This time, we won't wait. We left the meeting with a clear understanding. Horizon wouldn't make meaningful changes voluntarily. We would need to create circumstances that made change the most attractive option from a business perspective. Our strategy unfolded in 3 simultaneous tracks. First, the legal team filed coordinated complaints with housing authorities in every jurisdiction where Horizon operated, documenting code violations and discriminatory practices. Second, our media team launched a comprehensive campaign highlighting the human cost of Horizon's business model, featuring stories from tenants across the country. Third, we began investigating Horizon's corporate structure, investors, and financing arrangements. This third track proved particularly fruitful. Through public records and financial disclosures, we discovered that Horizon had financed their rapid expansion through bonds that included specific representations about the condition and management of their properties. Any material misrepresentation could potentially constitute securities fraud. More importantly, we identified their largest investors, pension funds, university endowments, and municipal investment pools that had social responsibility commitments, at odds with Horizon's actual practices. Angela's eyes lit up when we presented our findings. "This changes everything," she said. "These institutional investors care about their public image. If they realize their money is funding substandard housing and tenant harassment, they'll demand changes." We prepared comprehensive dossiers for each major investor, documenting the gap between Horizon's representations and the reality tenants experienced. Then we requested meetings with investment committee members, offering them the opportunity to address the issues before we took the information public. The response was immediate. Within days, Horizon received inquiries from alarmed investors questioning their management practices. University students organized protests demanding their endowments divest from Horizon until conditions improved. Public employee unions expressed concern about their pension funds being used to finance tenant displacement. 3 weeks after we began contacting investors, we received a call from Philip Morris. His tone had changed dramatically. "We need to talk," he said simply. Not just another meeting with presentations and posturing, a real conversation about finding a sustainable solution. The negotiations that followed were intense and complex, involving multiple stakeholders across various jurisdictions. Unlike our previous experience with Westview, where we were dealing with a single corporate entity under one state's laws, Horizon's structure required a more sophisticated approach. Working with housing attorneys from each affected state, we developed a framework agreement that would establish consistent standards while allowing for local implementation and enforcement. The key provisions included a comprehensive audit of all properties by independent inspectors, with repairs prioritized based on health and safety concerns, establishment of resident councils at each property with meaningful input on management, decisions, limitations on rent increases for existing tenants, with provisions for income-based adjustments, restoration of on-site management at larger properties, and improved maintenance response protocols, elimination of discriminatory screening practices and predatory fee structures. A dispute resolution system with teeth, including penalties for non-compliance. The most innovative aspect, however, was the accountability mechanism. Rather than relying solely on oversight committees as we had with Westview, the new agreement included a transparent performance dashboard that would be available to both tenants and investors. Property conditions, maintenance response times, tenant satisfaction metrics, and compliance with agreement terms would be tracked and publicly reported. We're aligning the interests of tenants and investors, I explained to our network leaders. Both groups want well-maintained properties with stable occupancy. By making performance transparent, we're creating market incentives for Horizon to uphold their commitments. After 2 months of negotiations, the Horizon Housing Accord was signed. Implementation began immediately, with independent inspectors arriving at properties across the country to document conditions and prioritize repairs. Local resident councils formed, often building on existing tenant organizations but now with formal recognition and authority. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, nor was it without setbacks. Some local managers resisted the changes, clinging to old practices until removed or retrained. Repairs sometimes progressed slower than promised. Disputes arose over interpretation of specific provisions. But unlike our previous victory, which had been vulnerable to corporate restructuring, this agreement had built-in resilience. When investors could directly monitor compliance through the dashboard, management had powerful incentives to address problems promptly rather than hide or minimize them. 6 months into implementation, the data showed measurable improvements. Maintenance response times had decreased by 62%, housing code violations were down 78%, and tenant retention had increased by 34%. Perhaps most significantly, resident council participation grew steadily, with more tenants recognizing their collective power to shape their living conditions. At a virtual gathering of the Horizon Tenant Network, we reflected on how far we had come since those dismissive whispers at Westridge years earlier. They thought we wouldn't last long, Gabriella remarked. But here we are, not just lasting, but leading the way to systemic change. And we're just getting started, Marcus added. What we've learned through this process about corporate structures, investment leverage, and coordinated action across jurisdictions, that knowledge can be applied to countless other housing providers. He was right. Our approach had evolved from addressing individual maintenance issues to challenging predatory business models. From seeking accountability from a single company to transforming industry practices. From local organizing to national movement building. As the call concluded, I sat at my kitchen table, looking at the framed photo from our first tenant union meeting at Westridge. So much had changed since then, yet the core principle remained the same: the power of collective action in the face of corporate indifference. My phone buzzed with a text from Angela. Have you seen the news? Horizon's CEO just announced his resignation. Board cited strategic differences, but sources say investors demanded change after reviewing our documentation. I smiled, thinking of those maintenance men and their whispered prediction. They had been right that I wouldn't last long. As a passive, isolated tenant willing to accept substandard conditions. Instead, I had become something none of us could have imagined, part of a movement that was fundamentally changing the relationship between housing providers and the people who called their properties home. The journey that began with one maintenance request had led to a national network of empowered tenants. The phone call that was meant to address one building's problems had sparked changes affecting thousands of apartments across multiple states. They had whispered, "I wouldn't last long," never expecting that their words would ignite a transformation that would outlast them all. A transformation that continued to grow, building by building, city by city, as tenants everywhere discovered what we had learned at Westridge. Alone, we might not last long against corporate power, but together, we could create lasting change. 5 years after that fateful day in the Westridge lobby, I found myself in an unexpected place, the governor's office at the State House. Seated around a large oak table were housing officials, legislative aides, and representatives from various tenant organizations across the state. Governor Miranda Hayes had convened this housing crisis task force in response to mounting public pressure about the affordable housing shortage. "The data is undeniable," said State Housing Director James Wilson, gesturing toward the projection, screen displaying grim statistics. Rental costs have increased 43% over the past decade, while median incomes have only risen 12%. Meanwhile, corporate ownership of residential properties has jumped from 15% to nearly 40% of all rental units. I studied the faces around the table as he spoke. Some showed genuine concern, others political calculation. The real estate industry. Representatives looked defensive, while fellow tenant advocates appeared both hopeful and skeptical about this high-level attention to issues we'd been fighting in the trenches for years. "What makes this situation different," the governor said, turning toward me, "is that we now have documented evidence of systematic abuses, thanks to the work of organizations like the Tenant Justice Network. Ms. Parker, would you share your perspective on what policy changes might actually make a difference?" It was surreal to be asked this question in this setting, to have the ear of policymakers who could implement structural changes beyond what any individual tenant action could achieve. The journey from worried tenant to housing policy advisor had never been part of my plan, but I had learned to embrace unexpected opportunities. "The issues we're facing aren't isolated incidents of negligent landlords," I began. "They're the predictable outcomes of treating housing primarily as an investment vehicle rather than a basic human need. The solutions must address this fundamental tension." Drawing on years of documentation from tenant organizations statewide, I outlined a comprehensive approach. Strengthened code enforcement with meaningful penalties, right to counsel for tenants, facing eviction, rent stabilization measures, tenant opportunity to purchase laws, and transparency requirements for corporate ownership structures. Most importantly, I concluded, we need to recognize tenant organizations as legitimate stakeholders in housing policy discussions, not just during crises, but as permanent partners in governance. The real estate lobbyists immediately pushed back, warning about unintended consequences and market disruptions. But something had shifted in the political landscape. The stories and data we had methodically collected over years had penetrated public consciousness. Politicians who once would have reflexively sided with property owners were now hearing regularly from constituents affected by housing instability. After 3 hours of discussion, Governor Hayes announced her intention to introduce the Housing Justice and Stability Act, incorporating many of our recommendations. The legislation wouldn't solve everything, but it represented a significant step toward rebalancing power in the housing ecosystem. As the meeting adjourned, Sandra Peters, the governor's chief policy advisor, approached me. "The governor was impressed with your presentation," she said. "We'd like to offer you a position on the newly formed Housing Equity Commission. It's a 3-year appointment with real authority to shape implementation of the new policies." I felt torn. Working within government would provide unprecedented opportunities to influence systemic change. But it would also mean stepping back from the grassroots organizing work that had driven our movement's success. "I need some time to think about it," I replied, "and to discuss it with my colleagues." That evening, I met with the core leadership team of the Tenant Justice Network, the evolution of our original union that now encompassed organizations across the state. We gathered at Ellie's apartment, which had become something of a headquarters for our movement. Her daughter, now in high school, brought us coffee before heading to her room to study. "They're trying to co-opt you," Marcus warned, his concern evident. Now in his 80s, he remained our moral compass. "Once you're inside the system, they'll use your presence to claim they're addressing the problems while watering down the actual solutions." "Or," countered Diana, "this could be our chance to have real influence. We've been fighting for a seat at the table for years. Now we're being offered one." The debate continued late into the night, reflecting the complex questions. Facing any movement that begins to gain institutional power, how do we engage with the very systems we've been challenging? When does compromise advance the cause, and when does it undermine it? By morning, we had reached a decision. I would accept the commission appointment, but with conditions. I would remain in my role with the Tenant Justice Network, maintaining independence to criticize government actions when necessary. And we would develop a rotating system where other tenant advocates would attend commission meetings with me, ensuring diverse perspectives and shared power. The next 2 years brought both progress and frustration. The Housing Justice and Stability Act passed after intense legislative battles, though with some provisions weakened. Implementation proved challenging, with regulatory agencies understaffed and enforcement mechanisms still developing. Corporate landlords found creative ways to circumvent new regulations, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation. Through it all, I straddled the worlds of institutional policy and grassroots organizing, bringing insights from each realm to the other. The commission work gave me unprecedented access to data, decision-makers, and regulatory levers. The network activities kept me grounded in tenants' lived experiences and collective wisdom. Neither approach alone would have been sufficient. The policy changes without grassroots pressure would have remained unenforced or been captured by industry interests. The organizing without policy engagement would have continued winning important but isolated victories without addressing structural conditions. One spring morning, as I prepared for a commission meeting, I received an unexpected call from Zoe Harrison, my old ally from Parkview Heights. Now working as a housing counselor in Seattle, she rarely reached out except for major developments. "Have you heard about the National Housing Database being proposed in Congress?" she asked without preamble. Congressman Reynolds introduced it yesterday. It would create a federal registry tracking corporate ownership of residential properties across state lines. I hadn't heard, but immediately recognized the significance. One of our biggest challenges had been the opacity of corporate ownership structures, the maze of LLCs and holding companies that obscured who actually controlled rental properties and allowed violations in one jurisdiction to go unnoticed in others. "This could be game-changing," I replied, already scheduling a call with our policy team. "Who's backing it?" "That's the interesting part," Zoe said. "It has unusual bipartisan support. Housing advocates, obviously, but also some unlikely allies. Rural representatives concerned about agricultural land being bought up by anonymous entities. National security folks worried about foreign investment in critical infrastructure. Even anti-money laundering crusaders who want to track suspicious real estate transactions." The Transparent Housing Ownership Act represented an opportunity to address a fundamental power imbalance in the housing ecosystem. If tenants and regulators could track who actually owned properties across corporate shells and state lines, enforcement of existing laws would become significantly more effective. Over the following months, our network joined a national coalition, advocating for the legislation. We contributed our documentation of how corporate landlords used complex ownership structures to evade accountability. We mobilized tenants to contact their representatives. We shared stories illustrating the human consequences of this deliberate opacity. The legislative fight was fierce. Real estate investment trusts, private equity firms, and development companies deployed armies of lobbyists to water down or kill the bill. Industry groups ran ominous ads warning that transparency requirements would drive up housing costs and reduce availability. During a critical phase of the campaign, I was invited to testify before the House Financial Services Committee. Sitting in the cavernous hearing room, preparing to address lawmakers, I thought about how far we had come from those first tentative conversations in the Westridge laundry room. "Ms. Parker," began Congresswoman Wilson, "your organization has submitted extensive documentation regarding corporate ownership patterns in residential housing. Can you explain to the committee why you believe transparency in this area is so important?" "The foundation of a functioning market is information," I replied. "Currently, tenants enter rental agreements with entities whose true ownership and track record are deliberately concealed. Regulations are enforced building by building, unable to identify pattern violations across properties controlled by the same beneficial owners. and communities cannot effectively identify which actual decision-makers are responsible for housing conditions affecting their residents' health and well-being. Over 3 hours of testimony, representatives from both parties questioned me about the practical implications of the proposed registry. Some were clearly carrying water for industry donors, pressing me on hypothetical harms to mom and pop landlords, who would actually be exempt from most requirements. Others seemed genuinely interested in how transparency could improve housing conditions in their districts. The bill passed the House but stalled in the Senate, where procedural maneuvers and filibuster threats created seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Just when passage seemed impossible, an unexpected development changed the dynamics entirely. A major investigative journalism collaboration published The Housing Papers, a massive exposé based on leaked documents from several of the largest corporate landlords in the country. The materials revealed internal strategies for evading regulations, identifying push-out targets, long-term tenants paying below-market rents, and calculating exactly how much maintenance could be deferred before triggering serious legal consequences. Most damning were the communications showing how companies deliberately created convoluted ownership structures, specifically to prevent tenants and regulators from connecting problems across properties. In one particularly shocking email, an executive wrote, "The Delaware LLC within Nevada holding company structure works perfectly. By the time they figure out who actually controls the property, the statute of limitations on the violations will have expired." Public outrage was immediate and sustained. Senators who had been blocking the bill found their offices flooded with calls and their fundraisers picketed by housing advocates. Within weeks, the Transparent Housing Ownership Act passed the Senate with a veto-proof majority and was signed into law. Implementation would take time, but the foundation had been laid for a fundamental shift in accountability. Corporate landlords could no longer hide behind anonymous shell companies, operating with impunity across jurisdictional boundaries. The information asymmetry that had disadvantaged tenants for generations was beginning to erode. As significant as these policy victories were, equally important was the cultural shift happening in communities across the country. Tenant organizing, once seen as a fringe activity for activists, had become normalized. People who never imagined themselves as organizers were forming tenant associations in luxury buildings, public housing, and everything in between. This became vividly clear during a tenant leadership training I conducted in a Midwestern city. Looking around the community center at the 30 participants, I was struck by their diversity, not just in terms of race, age, and background, but in the types of housing they represented. There were residents of subsidized housing sitting alongside tenants from upscale downtown developments, sharing strategies and building solidarity despite their different circumstances. During a small group exercise, I overheard a conversation between two participants that encapsulated this evolution. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," admitted Bradley Thomas, a retired accountant from a luxury condo building. "I always figured if you paid enough, you wouldn't have these problems." "That's what they want us to think," replied Keisha Williams, a longtime public housing resident and experienced organizer, "that our housing issues are individual problems with individual solutions. But they're actually connected, just operating at different price points." Bradley nodded thoughtfully. "When our HOA discovered the developer had used substandard materials that caused water infiltration, they tried to make each owner deal with it separately. It wasn't until we organized collectively that we got them to acknowledge their responsibility." "Exactly!" Keisha exclaimed. "Different buildings, same playbook. They divide us by class, by race, by neighborhood, but the tactics are remarkably similar. These connections, between public and private housing residents, between homeowners, and renters between urban and rural communities, represented perhaps the most profound achievement of our movement. We had begun to break down the artificial barriers that had prevented a truly broad-based housing justice movement. On the 7th anniversary of that fateful day in the Westridge lobby, I returned to the building for a community celebration. The The property had changed hands twice more since our initial organizing, but the strength of the tenant association had remained constant, ensuring that each ownership transition maintained standards and respected residents' rights. The lobby had been renovated again, this time with input from the resident council. The maintenance staff, now properly trained and adequately staffed, were preparing for winter by servicing the heating system proactively rather than waiting for emergency calls. In the community room, a tenant-led after-school program provided homework help and activities for children whose parents were still at work. Ellie, still a building leader, though now planning to move to be closer to her daughter who was starting college, greeted me with a warm hug. "Remember when we were afraid to even talk to our neighbors about the problems in our apartments?" she asked. "Now look at all this." Later, as we shared memories and plans with old friends and new residents, someone asked me what I considered the most important lesson from our journey. "I think it's that power doesn't just exist, it's created," I reflected. When I moved in here, I felt completely powerless against the management company. But that powerlessness wasn't a fixed reality. It was a condition they deliberately cultivated, through isolation and intimidation. I gestured around the community room, now filled with residents engaged in genuine conversation and collective problem-solving. The moment we began talking to each other, documenting our experiences and acting together, we created a different kind of power. Not power over others, but power with each other. And that's something they couldn't take away, no matter how hard they tried. That creation of collective power, from the hallways of Westridge to state legislatures to the halls of Congress, had transformed not just housing conditions but people's sense of what was possible. Those who had been told they wouldn't last long had not only endured, but had fundamentally altered the landscape they inhabited. The whispered dismissal that had once wounded me now seemed almost laughable in its misjudgment. They had failed to recognize what happens when people discover their collective strength. They had underestimated the power of solidarity to outlast corporate schemes and political maneuvering. They had missed entirely that sometimes the people, expected to quietly disappear, are the very ones who end up making the most lasting change. 10 years after that pivotal moment in the Westridge lobby, I found myself standing on the roof deck of a newly completed building unlike any I had encountered in my housing justice work. The Riverside Commons wasn't owned by a corporate landlord or a government agency. It was owned by its residents. This is the 8th tenant-owned building we've helped establish in the metro area, explained Nathan Cooper, the project coordinator for the Community Housing Trust. From acquisition to renovation to governance structure, the residents made every major decision collectively. I watched as future tenants toured their new homes, faces bright with the particular joy that comes from seeing long-term dreams materialize. Many had been involved in the project for nearly 3 years, attending countless meetings, navigating complex financing mechanisms, and learning about everything from building systems to cooperative governance principles. The commercial space on the ground floor will provide steady income to keep residential costs stable, continued Nathan, pointing toward the storefronts below. And 20% of the units are permanently affordable for households making below 50% of area median income. This building represented something I had barely dared to imagine when our movement began. Not just fighting against exploitative housing practices, but creating alternative models that centered resident control and community needs. It wasn't a utopian fantasy, but a pragmatic response to market failures, one made possible by years of policy advocacy, community organizing, and financial innovation. My visit to Riverside Commons was part of a national tour studying alternative housing models for the Federal Housing Administration's Innovation Initiative. After years of working both inside and outside formal policy structures, I had been appointed to lead a working group exploring how federal resources could better support community-controlled housing development. The appointment had been controversial within our movement. Some allies viewed it as dangerous co-optation that would blunt our critiques of government failures. Others saw it as a rare opportunity to redirect substantial resources toward community priorities. As with my earlier state-level role, I had accepted with the understanding that I would maintain my connections to grassroots organizations and use the position to amplify their perspectives. As we descended from the roof, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Supreme Court upholds Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act in 6-3 decision. I quickly scanned the article, relief washing over me as I absorbed the implications. The Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, TOPA, had been one of our movement's most significant policy victories, giving tenants the right of first refusal when their buildings were put up for sale. It had enabled dozens of tenant associations to purchase their buildings and convert them to cooperative or nonprofit ownership, preserving affordability and preventing displacement. But the real estate industry had challenged the law's constitutionality, claiming it represented an unjust taking of property rights. The court's decision, written by Justice Ramirez, concluded, "The act does not deprive property owners of their right to sell their property at market value. It merely ensures that existing tenants have the opportunity to match any offer. This reasonable regulation of the marketplace advances the legitimate state interest in housing stability and community preservation." I immediately called Angela, who had helped defend the law before the court. "We did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And not just for our state, this decision sets a precedent that will protect similar laws across the country." The victory felt particularly meaningful because it came at a time when our movement was facing significant backlash. After years of progressive policy wins, the pendulum had begun to swing as property owner associations and development interests poured unprecedented resources into rolling back tenant protections. Their campaign was sophisticated, framing tenant protections as the cause rather than the solution to housing shortages. Excessive regulations discourage investment in new housing, their advertisements claimed, blaming rent stabilization policies for rising housing costs despite evidence to the contrary. These attacks had gained traction with a public frustrated by persistent housing problems and susceptible to simplistic solutions. Several state legislatures had passed preemption laws blocking cities from implementing rent control. Funding for code enforcement had been slashed in multiple jurisdictions, and tenant organizing faced new legal obstacles as property owners increasingly included anti-organizing clauses in lease agreements. The Supreme Court decision offered a crucial counterbalance, affirming the constitutional validity of one of our most transformative policies. It wouldn't stop the backlash, but it provided a legal foundation for continuing to advance tenant-centered solutions. Later that week, I participated in a strategy retreat with leaders from housing justice organizations across the country. We gathered at a converted farmhouse retreat center, the kind of space where cell phone reception was deliberately poor to encourage full presence in the conversations. The diversity of the gathering reflected how much our movement had evolved. Present were tenant organizers from rural manufactured housing communities, fair housing attorneys fighting algorithmic discrimination in rental applications, community land trust developers, homelessness prevention specialists, and public housing resident council leaders. What united this ecosystem was a shared commitment to treating housing as a human need rather than merely a financial asset. "We need to acknowledge that we're in a defensive period," began Sophia Jefferson, a veteran organizer from Chicago. "After years of momentum, we're seeing coordinated efforts to undermine our victories. We can't just keep using the same playbook." "Agreed," added Luis Menendez from Miami. "We've gotten good at stopping bad things from happening and winning, incremental improvements. But we need a more compelling vision of what we're fighting for, not just what we're fighting against." The conversation continued late into the night, with passionate debate about priorities and strategies. Should we focus on defending existing victories or pushing for more transformative changes? Invest in electoral work to maintain political allies or build autonomous community-controlled alternatives? Pursue universal policies benefiting all renters or targeted interventions for the most vulnerable? By morning, we had reached general consensus on a multi-layered approach. We would defend existing protections through litigation and community mobilization, while simultaneously articulating a bold vision of housing justice that could inspire broader public support. We would strengthen connections between housing and other movements, from climate justice to racial equity to labor rights, recognizing the intersectional nature of these struggles. Most importantly, we would invest in developing the next generation of housing justice leaders, ensuring that those most affected by housing instability would shape the solutions. That last commitment felt particularly urgent to me. After a decade in this work, I was increasingly conscious of the need to share leadership and make space for new voices. The momentum we had built couldn't depend on any individual. It needed to be embedded in communities and institutions that would outlast all of us. With this in mind, I had been mentoring several young organizers, including Madison Taylor, a former tenant at Westridge who had been inspired by our organizing to pursue a career in housing justice. Now in her late 20s and leading a citywide tenant union, Madison represented the kind of grounded, visionary leadership our movement needed to thrive. "The landscape has changed so much since you started," Madison observed over coffee after the retreat. "Corporate consolidation of rental housing has accelerated. Technology has transformed how people find housing and how landlords screen tenants. Climate change is creating new habitability challenges and displacement pressures." She wasn't wrong. The housing ecosystem we now operated in barely resembled what had existed when I first moved into Westridge. Institutional investors owned and see ever larger share of the rental market. Algorithmic management systems had replaced many human property managers. Short-term rental platforms had removed significant housing stock from the long-term residential market. And climate disasters were rendering entire communities uninhabitable while insurance companies retreated from high-risk areas. "But the fundamental dynamics remain similar," I replied. "The tension between housing as a human need and housing as a financial asset. The power imbalance between property owners and residents. The use of housing policies to reinforce racial and economic segregation." Madison nodded thoughtfully. "That's why history matters. We're not starting from scratch. We're building on decades of organizing and policy experimentation. But we need to adapt the strategies for today's reality." Our conversation was interrupted by breaking news alerts on both our phones. A massive private equity firm had just announced the acquisition of over 10,000 housing units across 5 states, including several buildings where tenant organizations had been actively organizing for better conditions. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Madison said, showing me the alert. 10 years ago, that many units changing hands would have involved dozens of separate transactions over months or years. Now it happens with a single financial deal that tenants learn about after the fact. The acquisition represented both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge was clear. A powerful new owner with a reputation for aggressive rent, increases, and minimal property maintenance. But the opportunity was equally significant. A chance to coordinate tenant responses across multiple states and buildings from the outset, rather than organizing reactively property by property. Within hours, Madison had convened an emergency virtual meeting with tenant leaders from the affected properties. I joined as a resource person, sharing insights from our experiences with similar corporate transitions, but intentionally staying in the background as Madison facilitated the discussion. "They're counting on us being isolated from each other," she told the group. "They're hoping each building will respond separately, making it easier to dismiss concerns and play properties against each other for resources." The tenant leaders shared information about current conditions, outstanding maintenance issues, and recent communications from management. Patterns quickly emerged. Several buildings had recently had maintenance staff reduced. Others had received notices about upcoming property improvements that typically preceded steep rent increases. All had experienced decreased responsiveness from property management in recent months. They've been preparing for this sale by cutting costs and documenting artificial improvements to the balance sheet, observed Frank Rodriguez, a retired accountant and tenant leader from one of the affected buildings. By the end of the 3-hour call, the group had established a coordinated response plan, simultaneous building-wide surveys to document current conditions before the new owner could blame existing problems on former management. Formation of a cross-property tenant council with representatives from each building, and preparation of welcoming letters to the new ownership requesting good faith negotiation of a master agreement covering all properties. If they want to manage these buildings as a unified portfolio, will organize as a unified tenant body, Madison concluded. They think economies of scale only work for owners. We'll show them that collective action creates its own economies of scale for residents. Watching Madison skillfully guide the group through complex strategic decisions, I felt a profound sense of continuity and evolution. The approaches we had developed through years of trial and error were being absorbed, refined, and adapted by a new generation of leaders equipped with additional tools and insights. This, I realized, was perhaps the most meaningful measure of our movement's success. Not just the policies changed or the buildings transformed, but the emergence of new leaders who could carry the work forward with their own vision and voice. The following month brought an unexpected development in my own journey when Samantha Wilson, the newly appointed Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, invited me to join her transition team as a special advisor on tenant empowerment initiatives. The President has directed us to center tenant voices in reimagining federal housing policy, Samantha explained during our call. Your experience bridging grassroots organizing and policy development makes you uniquely qualified to help shape this agenda. The role would require relocating to Washington for at least a year, a significant commitment that would mean stepping back from much of my local work. After discussing it with close allies and mentees like Madison, I decided to accept the position, recognizing it as an opportunity to embed tenant-centered approaches in federal programs with nationwide impact. My first day at HUD headquarters was surreal. Walking through the imposing marble lobby, past portraits of former secretaries, I couldn't help but reflect on the improbable journey from worried tenant to federal housing advisor. The system I had once battled from the outside had created space within for perspectives shaped by that very struggle. The transition team included career civil servants, academic housing experts, and industry representatives, but notably, it also included public housing resident council leaders, tenant organizers, and fair housing advocates who had previously been excluded from such policy conversations. Our first major initiative was developing the Tenant Empowerment Rule, which would require all federally subsidized housing to establish and support democratically elected resident councils with meaningful input on property management decisions. The rule would affect millions of housing units, creating formal structures for tenant voice in places where residents had been systematically disempowered. As we worked through the complex process of federal rulemaking, navigating legal requirements, addressing potential unintended consequences, and building political support, I often thought about that moment in the Westridge lobby 10 years earlier. Those maintenance men had whispered that I wouldn't last long because they saw me as powerless, against a system designed to wear down resistance. They couldn't have imagined that their dismissive prediction would spark a journey leading to fundamental changes in that very system, changes that would long outlast their employment and the management practices they represented. During a public comment session on the proposed rule, a resident from a rural housing development in Appalachia approached the microphone. Eleanor Bryant, a grandmother raising 3 grandchildren in a property that had suffered decades of disinvestment, spoke with quiet determination. For 30 years, I've lived with broken promises about repairs that never happen and improvements that never come, she said. I've been told to be grateful for substandard housing because at least it's something. I've been treated like a problem to be managed rather than a person deserving of dignity. She paused, looking directly at the panel of federal officials. This rule won't fix everything wrong with housing in America. But for the first time, it gives people like me a real seat at the table, not as supplicants asking for favors, but as partners with rights and responsibilities for the places we call home. Eleanor's words captured the essence of what our movement had been fighting for all along. Not just better physical conditions or lower costs, but recognition of tenants' fundamental dignity and right to shape decisions affecting their homes and communities. As the session concluded, Samantha leaned over to me. "You know, when I appointed you to this role, some industry groups suggested you were too radical, that you would push for unrealistic policies that ignored market realities." She gestured toward Eleanor and the dozens of other residents who had traveled from across the country to share their experiences. But listening to these testimonies makes it clear, what's truly radical is a system that has excluded these voices for so long. What's unrealistic is expecting people to accept conditions none of us would tolerate for our own families. Her words affirmed what I had learned through years of organizing. The most practical solutions come from those closest to the problems. And the most sustainable changes are those that transform power relationships rather than merely ameliorating symptoms. As we left the hearing room, I received a text message from Madison with a photo attached. It showed tenant leaders from 3 of the buildings affected by the private equity acquisition, standing together outside the company's regional office holding a giant letter requesting formal recognition of their cross-property tenant council. The afternoon sessions showcased this evolution. In a workshop on digital organizing strategies, tenant leaders demonstrated sophisticated apps they'd developed for documenting code violations, tracking corporate ownership, and coordinating rapid response to eviction threats. In another on climate resilience and housing justice, organizers from coastal communities presented models for community-owned housing designed to withstand increasing severe weather while remaining affordable. During the closing reception, I found myself in conversation with Thomas Jenkins, the current Deputy Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Once a skeptical mid-level bureaucrat who had resisted tenant participation requirements, Thomas had gradually become one of our strongest allies within the federal system. "I'm still embarrassed by how dismissive I was when you first proposed the Tenant Voice Initiative," he admitted. "I was convinced it would create administrative headaches without meaningful benefits." "And now?" I prompted, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear his perspective. "Now we have data showing that properties with active tenant councils have lower maintenance costs, higher resident satisfaction, and better health outcomes. What I saw as inefficient extra process turned out to be the most effective approach all along." Thomas's evolution epitomized a broader shift in institutional perspectives on tenant participation, from viewing it as an obligation to be minimally fulfilled to recognizing it as essential to effective housing management. This cultural change within institutions represented perhaps our most durable achievement, outlasting any particular policy or program. As the reception wound down, I retreated to my hotel room to prepare for the next day's closing panel. Opening my laptop, I found an email from an unexpected source. Victor Chambers, the former property manager at Westridge, whose hostile response to our organizing had catalyzed our movement 15 years earlier. "You probably won't remember me," the message began awkwardly. "I managed Westridge Apartments during your tenancy there. I certainly remembered Victor. His threatening phone call and retaliatory eviction notices had featured prominently in our legal case and subsequent media coverage. According to LinkedIn updates Angela occasionally shared, he had left property management altogether after the Attorney General's investigation. "I've followed your work from a distance over the years," his message continued. "Initially with resentment, I'll admit, but as time passed, I've come to respect what you've accomplished. After leaving Westview, I spent years reflecting on my role in a system that prioritized profits over people's basic needs for safe, decent housing." Victor explained that he now worked for a nonprofit focused on developing affordable housing for seniors, applying his property management knowledge toward more constructive ends. "I'll never be able to undo the harm I participated in," he wrote. "But I hope my current work represents some measure of atonement." The message concluded, "Congratulations on all you've achieved. Those maintenance men were right about one thing. You didn't last long as the kind of tenant management wanted. Instead, you became something far more powerful." I sat with the email for a long time, unsure how to respond. Victor's apparent transformation didn't erase the harm he had caused, yet his acknowledgement represented another kind of victory. Evidence that systems change sometimes includes the transformation of individuals who once upheld those systems. Eventually, I drafted a brief civil response acknowledging his message and expressing appreciation for his current work, without either absolving or condemning his past actions. Some reconciliations remain necessarily incomplete, I reflected, closing my laptop. The final day of the summit featured a plenary session titled "The Next Horizon: Reimagining Housing as a Public Good." The panel included public housing residents, community development practitioners, policy experts, and international housing advocates sharing models from countries with more advanced social housing systems. As the discussion unfolded, I was struck by how far the conversation had evolved, from defensive fights for basic habitability to proactive visions of housing as infrastructure essential to community well-being. The focus had shifted from merely protecting tenants against the worst abuses to fundamentally restructuring housing ownership, finance, and governance to serve human needs rather than maximize returns. During the audience Q&A, a young organizer asked a question that captured this evolution. How do we move from building power to resist exploitation to building power to create alternatives? From fighting against what we don't want to building what we do want? The question resonated deeply with my own journey. When I had first organized with my neighbors at Westridge, our immediate goal was simply getting management to fix the heat and address health hazards. We had been fighting for the bare minimum, basic compliance with existing laws and lease obligations. Over time, our vision had expanded as we recognized that the problems we faced weren't just implementation failures, but design features of a system structured to prioritize property values over human needs. This recognition had led us to develop more transformative approaches: tenant purchase opportunities, community land trusts, cooperative ownership models, and democratic governance structures. As I rose to respond to the young organizer's question, I thought about how to distill 15 years of evolving strategy into a useful answer. The transition you're describing isn't linear, it's cyclical and simultaneous, I began. We never stop needing to resist exploitation, even as we create alternatives. The tenant union preventing evictions today is building the foundation for the community land trust tomorrow. The rent strike demanding repairs is developing the collective capacity that might eventually govern a resident-owned building. I shared examples from our own history, where defensive organizing against deplorable conditions had built relationships and skills that later enabled affirmative projects like cooperative conversion and policy development. Most importantly, I concluded, we need to recognize that the act of coming together to address immediate injustices already contains within it the seeds of the alternative we're trying to create. A world where decisions about housing are made collectively by those most affected, where home is a foundation for human flourishing rather than a vehicle for wealth extraction. As the summit concluded, I found myself back in that small courtyard, joined now by some of the original tenant leaders from Westridge and other early organizing sites. Most had continued their involvement in housing justice work in various capacities, some professionally, others as volunteer community leaders or board members of housing organizations. "Did you ever imagine it would grow like this?" asked Ellie, gesturing toward the convention center where attendees were beginning to disperse toward airports and train stations. "Never," I admitted. "I just wanted my radiator fixed." We laughed, together, marveling at the unlikely journey from that first tentative conversation in the Westridge laundry room to a nationwide movement, encompassing thousands of organizations and millions of households. As our small group parted ways with promises to reconnect at Madison's upcoming campaign fundraiser, I lingered in the courtyard, watching the late afternoon sun filter through magnolia blossoms. My phone buzzed with a final message from the summit organizers. Transportation to National Housing Memorial leaving in 10 minutes from main entrance. The recently completed memorial honored those who had lost their lives due to housing injustice. From victims of fires in neglected buildings to elders who died from preventable exposure during utility shutoffs, to those who perished while unhoused on America's streets. It served as a solemn reminder of the human consequences when housing is treated as a commodity rather than a human right. As I made my way toward the memorial shuttle, I passed a maintenance worker repairing a light fixture in the convention center hallway. Our eyes met briefly, and he nodded with the simple respect of one worker acknowledging another. In that ordinary moment of human connection, I felt the distance traveled from those dismissive whispers 15 years earlier. The maintenance men at Westridge had been right about one thing. I hadn't lasted long as the kind of isolated, disposable tenant their business model required. Instead, I had become part of something far more durable. A movement that had transformed not just buildings and policies, but the very conception of what housing could and should be in a just society. A movement that would continue evolving, long after any individual participant, creating space for all people to experience home, not as a precarious privilege, but as a fundamental right. Those who had whispered, "I wouldn't last long," could never have imagined how their attempt to intimidate one tenant would help spark a transformation that would ultimately shorten the occupancy of exploitative practices throughout an entire industry. A transformation that continues to grow, building by building, policy by policy, community by community, outlasting those who once believed their power was permanent and tenants' resistance futile. In the end, it wasn't just their occupancy as managers that was shortened by one phone call and the movement it launched. It was the occupancy of an entire paradigm that treated housing as a mere financial asset, rather than the foundation of human dignity and community well-being. And in its place, we were building something designed to last. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.